Okay, welcome back to episode 8 of the Bible Connection podcast. Guys, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. My name is Joshua Williams. I'll be your facilitator, and with me are my good friends Taylor.
Good evening.
Brandon.
Not facilitating.
Yep, and John.
Hello.
So, guys, this week we're discussing the closing chapters of Numbers from 16 to 36. Just a quick recap. 1 through 9, we talked about the census and their sanctification. 10 through 14, we talked about their complaining and doubting and how the promised land was rejected to this generation. So following into that, last week, we also ended on looking at the bad report given by the 10 spies sent to Canaan and the people's rebellion and their punishment, right? So in chapter 16, we see the heading in our Bibles called Korah's Rebellion. What was this rebellion about?
Well, there's this guy named Korah. He's one of the sons of the generations of Levi. And then these other two guys named Dathan and Abiram, and they're from the tribe of Reuben. And they gather 250 chiefs of the people of Israel, and they basically accuse Moses. They're like, "You're the reason why things are so bad, and you are a tyrant that you want to rule over us, and you're lying about this land of milk and honey. You're not going to take us," completely disregarding the fact that they are the ones that disbelieved God and failed to enter into his promise as punishment. And so Moses has to respond to these people. He has to respond to these accusations. And he says, well, we should take up censers of incense and go before the tent of the Lord and let the Lord decide. And they're grumbling and accusing him so much, he even petitions the Lord and says, do not hear their offerings, don't take them. And so when they bring their offerings before the Lord doesn't accept their offerings. And these three people and their whole families and their little ones, their whole tents are just swallowed up straight into Sheol, straight into the grave. And the other 250 are burned immediately in fire, to the point where all that's left behind is the bronze incense censers that they were trying to offer. And so God says, take these, hammer them down, and cover up the altar with this bronze so that nobody will ever forget not to basically rebel in this way.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how the language that they use in tempting the people of Israel, and you'll see in chapter 16, starting verse 13, they're saying, "Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in this wilderness, that you must also make yourself a prince over us?" Now, if you as you're reading that, you may skip over the fact that they're not saying that the land that they're going to is like milk, is flowing with milk and honey. They're saying, no, what we came from was a place flowing with milk and honey. And what they're doing is twisting what what God has said to them. God told them in Exodus that I'm going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey if you will just go and take it. And Dathan and Abiram here are saying, no, God, you have lied to us. Moses, you have lied to us. And what's interesting is the language here is much like the serpent in the garden. No, Eve, this you will not surely die, right? But you will be like God, knowing good and evil, right? And hearkening back to that, after the curse, there's going in Genesis 3:15. You'll remember we talked about way back in episode 1. We talked about that there's the serpent and the seed motif going, this thread going through Scripture. And this is one of the many places you'll see how the language of how the serpent is deceiving the people of Israel, trying to thwart the seed that's to come. So it's many places like this we'll see going forth.
And we see that it is tempting the whole congregation of Israel, because it's not just these 250 elders and these 3 men that are judged, but immediately following, like, the people begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron. Again, I would not have the courage to grumble at this point. I'd keep my mouth shut. But they say, you killed those people. And so what does God do? He says, get away from them. I'm going to kill them. I'm going to strike them down. And Moses is like, quick, Aaron, go grab the censer from the altar and run towards the people. Because as he's running towards them, they're dropping like flies with a plague. And the moment he stands between the plague and the people, the plague stops. And he's standing between the dead and between the living. And so the Lord needs to clarify at this point, okay, stop accusing Moses and Aaron. I'm going to give you a sign. I'm going to give you a sign that these are the people that are supposed to be leading the sacrifices that I have chosen. And so this is where we get the ordeal of the 12 staffs and the 12 chiefs of the people of Israel. And Aaron, his staff buds with almonds and with life, showing that he is this garden keeper of the tabernacle. He is this person that is supposed to be guarding the tabernacle and supposed to be basically leading the worship in the tent of meeting.
Yeah, and there's multiple things I'd like to say in that is you see, Aaron's staff is taken from a live piece of wood, right? I mean, this staff was originally alive and then it was dead, right? And now it's budding. There's new life. And this is another theme that if you read the scriptures carefully from beginning to end, you will see that there's death and resurrection, not just in Jesus, right? But throughout Scripture, there's death, and Abraham is as good as dead, right, when he receives the promise. But yet there's new life given to him. There, multiple places there's death and resurrection. Israel, is spoken of as dead, and there's new life breathed into Israel. Multiple places this death and resurrection motif, and this almond tree basically budding from Moses' staff is vindicating Aaron as a true prophet, just as how Paul will mention that in Romans chapter 1, I believe it's verse 5, that Christ was demonstrated to be the Son of God through the resurrection, right? So through new life, he's demonstrated as the true prophet, the true king, priest, and prophet. So
I find it interesting, going back to, you'll see that they're men of Reuben. Reuben, if you remember, he's the eldest son, the firstborn son. So it's almost like they're questioning, hey, we're the ones that should be entitled and be in this position. And then they're kind of questioning Moses, yeah, come on, we're from Reuben. And it kind of trickles from there. What I found interesting, too, is when Moses said, this is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things. This is the test. And the test it's just so fascinating. If they die a natural death, then Moses was not sent by the Lord. But if the Lord brings something totally new and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, then you'll know that they've treated the Lord with contempt. So it's like that. Out of all the tests that you could have picked, they picked the one where the earth splits open, an earthquake happens, and they die from it. It's a very vivid.
This is not a Gideon-like test where it's like, well, maybe wool is supposed to have dew on it in the morning. It's like the ground doesn't normally just swallow people up out of nowhere.
It's very apparent what happened.
Yeah, and I like this. This is actual candid conversation here, but the language of the earth swallowing them up, I can't help but think about that this is very similar to the waters of judgment swallowing, Pharaoh's army. Mm-hmm. The water consumes them now, just like the enemy, Pharaoh and his army were the enemies of the Lord. Now within the own Israel's own camp, there's an enemy within, and the Lord is swallowing them up with the ground.
So like another thing I think the people of Israel are missing here is that it's not just like, oh, you get to be a tyrant, you get to be a prince that rules over the people. But this is a life or death, risky job to be one of these priests in the tabernacle. This is akin to taking on one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire world, because you are standing between this plague that enters the people when they sin against God, and you're the one that's supposed to be living in righteousness to stand in between them. And so here in chapter 18, we get this description of the duties of the Levites, and you see that they're not going to get an inheritance of the land, and they're not going to be allowed to basically take any of the actual promised land for themselves, but instead they're going to receive a tithe from the offerings of the people, and they're responsible for bearing the iniquities of the people. And so I just think that the people fundamentally had a misunderstanding about the priesthood, and that's why Moses is describing it here once again. This is the task of the Levites.
And what's interesting, you might think, well, poor Levites, you didn't get your fair share of the land. Well, the book of Numbers, the Torah is saying that the Lord is your portion,
Lord
right?
is the portion.
And we should see that as, we should read that as they got the best.
The cake.
You know, they got the living God as their portion. And I think that's what the psalmist is saying in Psalm 73. You know, whom have I in heaven but you, and on earth there's none I desire besides you. Though my heart and my flesh may fail, God, you are the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Psalm 16:11. You know, God, in your presence is fullness of joy, and at your presence are pleasures forevermore. You know, that type of language comes from, that thinking.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Psalms, because I've been looking for any excuse to take us here tonight.
There you go.
But talking about the Psalms is actually structured into 5 different books. If you ever read the book of Psalms, you see that the Psalter has like the book 1 and book 2 and book 3. And so in book 4 of the Psalms, it's chapters 90 through 106 in our Bible. And there's a lot of literature and a lot of commentary that describes how the 5 books of the Psalter mirror the 5 books of the Torah. And sometimes I look at that and I'm like, maybe, and then I look at Numbers and I'm like, heck yes, like it really does. So if you open your Bibles to Psalms chapter 90, it'll talk about how they're asking the Lord to teach them to number their days, that they may apply their hearts unto wisdom.
And Psalm 90 being attributed to Moses.
Yes. And then when you end in Psalm 106, it's actually completely a recap of what the Lord has done throughout the book of Numbers. And so I really encourage you, if you're confused about like, what am I supposed to take away from this story in Numbers, sit down, read Psalm 106. It's just one chapter, and it goes through story after story that brings you enlightenment and understanding about what we're supposed to take away from all these stories.
As we read through, and this is kind of branching off that, we're in chapter 16 here. If you go all the way back to the Exodus, to Leviticus, to Numbers here, you just see this constant complaining of Israel. And what Brandon was mentioning earlier about the Levites, they're not happy with the portion they've been given. It's like whatever they've been given, they're not going to be happy with. And I think that's just an example of like all of us in some fashion. And we're always not satisfied with whatever God has given us. This job, well, I don't make enough money. This house is not big enough. This car, it's too old. I mean, I think that we often point out the Israelites for being this grumbling people when at the same time they're very much the same as the way we are today. And we act like unthankful of the things that we have, and we see that lived out here, and we should use it as a way to kind of recognize the sins in our life for not being thankful for what we have been given. So I don't know how I could work this in, so this is the way I want to work this in. But my wife and I have taught Sunday school for about 6 years now. And about 4 years ago, we were teaching through the Exodus, and we got to Numbers, and we were talking about the Israelites being out in the desert and how they weren't happy with this or they weren't happy with that. They were
Where's
grumbling.
our water?
Where's our water? I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. It's hot.
We have no food. Well, we have food, but it's worthless food.
Exactly. It's worthless food. So I'm a big fan of visually teaching. If you've ever been with me, I like to use PowerPoints because I like to show pictures and maps and all that. So I can't remember if it was this lesson or another one, but I came in early one Sunday morning, and it was in June, I'm pretty sure, and I turned the air condition off. And
In the college house.
So at the time, we had like 20, 25 people in the room, no air condition. It is probably 80 plus degrees in there. And we're literally teaching on the Israelites grumbling and not being thankful. And everyone in that room, except for maybe a few. Josh, were you in there at the time?
I'm pretty sure, myself, I'm an electrician. I'm pretty sure at one point I went to go try and fix it and just make sure.
I think I actually remember that. So everyone was grumbling. Everyone was complaining. It's hot. And it was only 80 degrees in there. And we were sitting on like chairs. So like to put in perspective, we have a lot of things of much less difficulty, including myself, that we grumble and complain about. When the Israelites, it was 120 degrees in Sinai every day by noon. It was a lot harder. It was less comfortable, and they had conditions that they complained about. It wasn't okay with them, but it's something that we can do to relate.
There's one other thing I'd like to say. relating to this, the staff that budded in at the end of chapter 17 is in verse 10. It says, put back the staff of Aaron before the testimony and keep it as a sign for the rebels, that they may make an end of their grumblings. Right. So even after Aaron dies, his staff is put in and is kept with the ark, and the commandments, and is mentioned, multiple times throughout the rest of the Tanakh, and is even mentioned in the New Testament. And it's a visual sign there perpetually, right? Obviously it's not there anymore, but it's there, in information form for us now. So it doesn't. This is not the last time we're going to see the staff that budded.
All right, jumping into chapter 20.
Whoa! Can I stop you there?
Oh, okay.
Chapter 18. This strange. I tell my class, I like the deep, weird stuff in the scriptures. And if you look at in chapter 18, look at verse 19 through 20. Halfway through 19, the ministry of the priests is said halfway through 20. It says, in verse 19, all the holy contributions that the people of Israel present to the Lord, I give you and to your sons and to your daughters with you as a perpetual due. It is a covenant of salt before the Lord, for you and for your offspring with you. The Lord said to Aaron, you have no inheritance in the land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people. Now, this you might think, what in the world? A covenant of salt? What is he talking about? Well, in Leviticus, it talks about how salt is always to be given with the offerings. And then you see in a couple other places in the Tanakh, and then also in 2 Chronicles, it says that the kingship of David is also a covenant of salt, right? So the priesthood of Israel and the kingship of David is a covenant of salt, right? And you might think, what in the world? Where is he going with this? Well, think about it. What is the church supposed to be? Salt and light. We are to be kings. The kingship of Israel is given as a covenant of salt, right? And priests, right? We are to be a kingdom of priests to the world, right? That we are to the light is to go out from us, and throughout the world, right? So very interesting. There's multiple places. Like I said, we'll see this again in
more about salt to come.
More about salt.
More about salt, not salting, salt.
All right, now jumping into chapter 20. Moses is told by God, I believe in chapter 20, verse 12, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given to them. What did Moses do?
Well, in Exodus, God told Moses to strike the rock, right? But this time, he's very particular with him and says, take your staff in your hand and tell the rock to yield its water. And when Moses goes before the people, he says, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And he lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice. And so mechanically what he did was he spoke a little message that he wasn't told to say, and then he struck the rock with his staff instead of talking to it. And so the Lord accuses him rightfully accuses him of not believing in him and not upholding his holiness. And so earlier I suggested you all should turn to Psalm 106 when you're wondering what these stories are trying to say. And in Psalm 106, verses 32 and 33, it says, they angered him at the waters of Meribah, and it went ill with Moses on their account, for they made his spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. And so it was both a heart issue, the bitterness in his heart with all this grumbling and complaining had finally gotten to him, and then it was also an action issue. He had misspoken about the Lord's holiness and claimed that he was going to bring forth the water, and it was wrong before the Lord to do so.
And there's a connection here, a big one in 1 Corinthians 10, a few verses I want to read here. But Paul is this is a big theological word, recapitulating what happened in the wilderness here and is applying it to the church, right? Much like how Isaiah will do with David, and then what he calls the new Exodus. Paul is using that same type of language for the church here. But in 1 Corinthians 10, it says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses." John, you read this a few weeks ago. Into the sea, and all ate of the same food, and all drank of the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that flowed, that followed them. The rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Sound familiar? Now, the things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. 23,000 of them fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. I think you're going to speak of, you got a little something for us on serpents here in a minute, don't you, John? Sure. Nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come.
And so, drawing from this connection, Moses is here basically losing his temper, losing his patience, failing to uphold the holiness of the Lord before the eyes of the people. And so the very next thing we see from the people is the logical conclusion. When your leadership fails, when they're bitter in their heart, when they fail to uphold the Lord's holiness, they complain and grumble again. And this time, as they're going around from out of Mount Hor and out of the way of the Red Sea, the people are saying, we don't have any food. We don't have any water. We have worthless food, which means that they do have food, but they're just not thankful for it. I was cracking jokes about that earlier.
It's not organic.
And the Lord, he sends fiery serpents among the people to bite them so that many of them would die. So again and again and again, they're grumbling against the Lord, and he keeps breaking out in his wrath and punishment towards them. But this time, there's a unique pattern that I think is important to see. The people are being bitten, and they're dying, and the people said to Moses, we've sinned. We've spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he would take away the serpents from us. Then Moses prayed for the people, and then the Lord provided a way of escape. And he told Moses to craft this fiery serpent and set it on a standard or a pole. And everyone who's bitten, when he sees it, he shall live. And so what you have here is the people are grumbling and sinning in their hearts against God. God is visiting them in his judgment. The people are turning from that sin, recognizing their wrong, and petitioning for forgiveness. And then an intercessor makes a way for them. And so we're going to visit this bronze serpent again throughout the Old Testament. It's going to be picked up on in Isaiah. It's going to be talked about in the time of Hezekiah and 2 Kings. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I just want you to see here what's happening in the story in that pattern, because my favorite passage in the Bible, and one that I think every single listener in this podcast is familiar with, John chapter 3, Christ is quoting this passage. He's referring to this passage to Nicodemus when he explains John 3:16. So rest in it, read it, chew on it, think about it, and we'll be visiting it again in the future.
And branching off that too, so the snake on the pole is a really strange way to communicate that message. At least it was to me. If you look back in Exodus 17, you'll notice that Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner." So there's an interesting tie between what a banner was and what the snake is used here. So the idea of flags or banners comes from the back in Egypt, and in their temples they would put banners atop of the temple, and it was a way to communicate a military expedition or something that had been conquered. So the banner, like a soldier carrying a banner into battle, their temples always had banners on them. Thus you would know to put your eyes and follow the symbol of the banner. So looking up toward that flag, toward that banner, you would recognize whose allegiance you were to, and who you were looking to recognize who was in authority. So this was so common back in Egypt that the hieroglyph for God was actually a banner, a picture of a banner. So it was very common and well understood to the Israelite people that looking up to a banner was looking up to God and recognizing who is in control. So when the Israelites had been bitten by the venomous snakes and they looked to the bronze snake on the pole, they were actually looking up to the banner that pointed upward to God, whose power healed them. So, and John mentioned this earlier, it's in Isaiah, but I'll read this one little piece real quick. In Isaiah 11, it says, "In that day there shall be a root of Jesse who shall stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious." The banner from the root of Jesse would ultimately point to the presence of God and direct the eyes of the nations toward him. So that is just what John mentioned earlier. It's pointing to John 3, and Jesus quotes this. Jesus is the banner who points to the Father and signifies his presence.
And if it's strange for you that it's a snake, like why is Jesus represented by this snake? Just remember that the strangeness of it is supposed to be striking. Don't forget that he became sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. And so in a strange way, Jesus became the curse, the object of God's wrath on the cross, that by looking to him, bearing our sin, we would be made new and made clean. So don't let the strangeness of the picture take away from what Christ teaches us it means.
Well, Hebrews uses the language. The author of Hebrews says, through death, he destroyed the power of death. Right? You know, he's used the irony of that is he's the instrument that he's using. He's using the instrument that he's trying to just anyway.
Well, speaking of using strange instruments to reveal his message, what do we have going on next, Josh? What's our next question?
So, getting spicy. All right. Following Moses' punishment, you have Israel interacting with the Edomites, the king of Arad, king of the Amorites, and then the king of the Moabites. So in that, how is God providing for Israel as they interact with each of these kings?
Well, there's a lot of things going on. First, the people come to Edom, and they say, "Can we pass through your land? We won't drink your water. We might drink your water. We'll pay for your water." And Edom just says no. And so this rejection is going to come back to Edom in the later generations as their destruction. So Edom is supposed to be a brother nation. If you remember Esau, the brother of Jacob, who is Israel, Esau's descendants were Edom. And we see this in the generations established in Genesis, I think 36, 35?
Sounds good.
Somewhere.
One of those numbers.
Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, you're going to see Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. I'm not just quoting all the books of the Bible. Joel, Amos. They all condemn Edom.
Obadiah, yeah.
Edom is going to be judged and judged harshly for their rejection of their brother Israel and for their continued sin and being a thorn in his side. But for now, they have to go around him. And so they conquer Arad when Arad attacks them. They conquer Sihon, and they're given these cities to dwell in. They conquer Og. So all of these different nations, the Lord's giving them victory over these kings. And because of this, as they approach Midian, as they approach Moab, this king, Balak, is terrified of them. And I also think back to Moses in Exodus 15:15, when he says that the people of Moab are terrified. They're seized with terror because of what God did to the Egyptians. And so you have Balak scheming. He's like, how can I take this nation, these people who God has promised to bless who blesses them and curse who curse them? How can I turn this on its head? I know, I'll hire my own prophet. And he takes Balaam. He says, Balaam, man, if I got a deal for you, I'll give you gold, I'll give you servants, I'll give you fame, I'll give you flocks, whatever you want, just come here and curse these people. And Balaam says, well, I can only say what the Lord tells me to say. And he sends his servants back. He's like, but I'll make you rich. He's like, well, God, can I go talk to him? And the Lord says, you may go, but he's clearly unhappy with him. You get this story of the donkey. And the donkey that he's riding on is going down the road, and it keeps going to the left and going to the right, and he knocks his legs into a hedge, and he's beating this donkey with a stick because he's angry. He's like, I'm trying to go here. I'm trying to talk to this king. I don't want to scuff my shoes. I don't want to get injured. And so here he's beating his donkey, and one of the strangest things in the Bible happens. The donkey first starts talking, and then Balaam talks back to him. I don't know about you, but if I hear
it ain't no thing.
Like if I hear a talking donkey, I'm probably freaking out.
I'm gonna have an aneurysm myself.
And we see from the text that the first thing the donkey did was actually see the angel of the Lord, right? He saw the angel of the Lord, and he veered him away from destruction. And then he spoke to Balaam and told him, like, why are you hitting me? What have I done wrong? Am I not a good donkey? Haven't I let you ride me all these years and I've never taken you off the road? I think it's a she donkey, and actually, I don't know why I keep saying he. Anyway, one of the things I think we need to point out here is that these are the two things that prophets actually do. Prophets see visions of the Lord, and they speak for God. And here you have this donkey doing it. And so if you're uneasy about this prophet that's not from the people of Israel, this random prophet being called to start prophesying, just remember, the Lord can make anyone, even a donkey, speak for him and see his visions. And so the Lord is about to use him in these 4 oracles that are not only establishing blessings over Israel rather than curses, what Balak wants, but I think Moses begins his, and let's talk about theological words, his eschatological development, the latter days, from this 4th oracle of Balaam. So, do you mind if I keep going? I know I've been talking a little while.
Well, you mentioned that Balaam came to curse Israel, but yet in his cursing he can't curse Israel. All he can do is blessing, and you should immediately think blessing Israel. You should immediately think Genesis chapter 12, and usually Taylor's the Abraham guy, but I'm gonna read it here. I think it's Genesis 12. I'm sorry. And in the calling of Abraham, he says, "Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, and the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And if you remember, this is picking up on the Genesis 1:28, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over it, and how it's expanding into the Abrahamic covenant. And now we see exactly what this is looking like in a real time example. Balaam is going to curse Israel, and the Lord. And this was an example we talked about before. I couldn't help but think about the movie Liar Liar with Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey, he's going to say these lies, but he in the most awkward way has to say the most awkward truths ever. And I imagine every time I read this, I think about that movie. Balaam's, everything in him is wanting to curse Israel, but yet he turns around and blesses Israel. I can't help but think about that movie.
It is really funny because he's going there to seek riches. That's why the Lord sent an angel to kill him on the way until the donkey basically saves him. And then the Lord says, "Only speak what I let you speak." And so he goes and does this first oracle, and Balak is ready. He's like, "Please curse these people. Look at this portion." And it's like, it's wrong to curse Israel, and Israel's mighty in number, and everybody should want to be like them when they die. And he's like, no, that's not what I asked you to do. You need to come over here to this other place, and you need to bless me and curse Israel. And his next thing is, Israel shall not be cursed. God is with them, and they're going to have victory over all of their enemies. He's like, okay, how about you just stop blessing or cursing altogether and just don't say anything? He's like, no, I have to speak what the Lord says. And then in his third one, he gets into these beautiful blessings for the people of Israel. He says, first, "How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, and your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes of the Lord that has planted, and like cedar trees before the waters." Balaam now sees the truth, right? He sees like, okay, I don't need to divine things. The Lord likes it when I bless these people. And he starts speaking about how the tents of Jacob are like a flowing garden in the presence of God, how he's going to be fruitful and multiply, how his king will be exalted, how he'll have victory over all of his adversaries. And Balaam starts clapping his hands together. It's like, just go home. Stop blessing them. And the last thing that he does is he speaks this prophecy about the latter days. And you're going to see this description in the latter days in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 31, the prophet Hosea in chapter 3, Isaiah in chapter 2, Micah chapter 4, Jeremiah 23, Ezekiel 38, Daniel chapter 2. This idea of the latter days, what's going to happen in the end of days, is coming up, and Moses is developing it with this oracle. He says, I see him now, but not now. I behold him near, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. He shall crush the forehead of Moab, and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir and his enemies shall be dispossessed. Israel's doing valiantly, as one of Jacob exercising dominion and destroying all the cities. All of Israel's enemies in the latter days will be completely crushed. The head of the serpent, Genesis 3:15, will be crushed by the offspring of woman. And now the head of Moab, who is here out of this story about these serpents devouring and biting the people, he's trying to curse the people. All curses are rooted in the original curse of the snake trying to curse people. His head will be crushed. And so we see this beautiful unflowering, opening up of God's vision for what is going to happen in the end of times.
Well, let's qualify end of times here, latter days. Greg Beale does a great job in his biblical theology of talking about what this term latter days means. And a lot of times we think about, when we hear the term end times, latter days, we think about, Tim LaHaye, Left Behind type thinking, rapture, all this stuff. That's not what it means. The latter days was inaugurated at Jesus' death and resurrection.
Absolutely.
We are in the latter days now, right? That is what these texts are talking about. It's not talking about the millennium and all this stuff. If you trace that term throughout the scriptures and let the scriptures define what the latter days are, it's speaking of the intertestamental times between Jesus' first and second coming. That is the latter days. But I'd like to go back to, I'd like to go back to Balaam's second oracle, backtrack a little bit if we can. And this passage is used a lot, and Jim Hamilton in the Bible Talk podcast did a great job. I would highly encourage anybody to go back and listen to this episode. He was talking about how in systematic theology we use this text to build our doctrine of God, and we're way over time. I apologize. That in Numbers 23:19, God is not a man that he should lie, or the son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, will he not do it? And what we should think about, is God's not going to change his mind, because he's made his covenant with Abraham. He's not going to change that. That's the foundation of this text. But if you keep going in verse 21, and he says, he has not beheld misfortune from Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. And this is the text I want us to see here. The Lord, their God, Yahweh, their Elohim, is with them. Okay, is with them. The shout of a king is among them. With and among are paralleling there. We should see that Balaam is prophesying, is saying that Yahweh is among this people. He's with them, right? And this strange passage, and I think we can build it into our Christology that Yahweh, in some sense, as we look back on this, and especially as we take that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, and if we take these and combine these passages, this, in some sense, Yahweh is their king, is going to be among them, and ultimately that is foreshadowing Jesus as being our king and being among us, God being with us and among us.
We're basically out of time.
Can
Can I take like 2 minutes, just give us a 50,000-foot view of the rest of Numbers before this podcast ends?
Hey, time is of nothing to me.
I would love to hear that,
I
John.
don't.
Okay.
I don't bottle the spirit up.
So I don't know if it's the spirit, but I would hope so.
Pour it out,
Spirit,
John. Pour
please
it
be
out.
with me. So exiting from this, we see that immediately afterwards, the people of Israel begin to intermarry with these Midianite women and worshiping Baal. And they are rejecting the Lord, and the Lord breaks out against them once again to kill them. And you have this righteous man named Phinehas, who's the son of Eleazar, a grandson of Aaron, who spears with a spear this one man and this Midianite woman who are sinning in the congregation. And the Lord basically takes this moment to recognize him and to establish his covenant with Aaron's descendants. And from there, you get this census of the new generation. The sin is finally, the grumblings are finally over. The sin has finally been dealt with. Not that it's dealt with forever. You're going to see in the book of Joshua and Judges, the people are not done. But this new census takes place, and you see that grounded in a historical moment, these people have not only aged into this new generation, but they're now geographically moving towards the shores of the promised land. And from there, you do get more offerings, you get vows, you get all of these things that you would expect to see back in Leviticus and Exodus. But the Lord's now reestablishing with this new generation, these are the ways and times you are to worship me. And he's dealing with a few things that have come up since the people have been given these laws, a few issues. One, like, what do you do when all of the male heirs have died off and you're about to enter the promised land? Do the women not get an inheritance? Well, the Lord says, no, these women shall receive an inheritance. He's going to provide for these women. They can either marry into other men that will receive their inheritance, or if they're not married, they will receive the land for themselves. And there's these vows that the Lord has said that you're not to break a vow with him. But what do you do when a woman then marries into a family that she's made a vow and the husband doesn't want to hold the family to that vow? You know, they're supposed to cleave to one flesh. How's that supposed to work? And so he says, in this situation, the man shall take the responsibility of discerning when he hears of the vow whether the family will keep it. And if he says they're going to keep it and then doesn't let his wife keep it, he will bear the iniquity. And if he says they're not going to keep it, the Lord will forgive the wife as he merges into this family. And we
live the patriarchy.
Thank you for that. And as they approach the promised land, they're receiving more victory over the Midianites, and Reuben and Gad decide not to go into the promised land. And so Moses at first is furious. He's like, you are just like your sinful fathers. You're not going to enter the promised land. What's wrong with you? And they're like, well, we're going to build up for our flocks, and then the warriors will enter the promised land with our brothers, and we'll help to fight and conquer the land, and then we'll go back. And Moses is like, make an oath. This is what you're going to do. And if not, let the Lord cast you out. Let the Lord judge you. And so as we end the book of Numbers, the people are on the shore of the Jordan. They're ready to cross into the promised land. They're given the boundaries and the landmarks. This is where you're supposed to inhabit. This is where you're supposed to live. This is where the Levites are supposed to live. This is what happens when you're supposed to be journeying from city to city as a sojourning criminal that might have committed manslaughter. They give all of these laws so that the people are poised to enter the land and take the inheritance, unlike their parents who sinfully rejected God in the days of the 10 spies. So,
what a beautiful way to end Numbers. I love it. Anybody else got anything else before we close out?
I think that was a great way to close.
Yeah, I'm with you. So, listen, we love hearing from our listeners. We love getting questions. So remember, you can share your questions with us. You can either do it by emailing us at thebibleconnectionbdbc@gmail.com, or we post on YouTube, so you can just simply leave a comment on the video. Also, if you see us in church or just, somehow have our cell phone numbers, just hit us up any way you can. But we'll see you on episode 9.